Okay, so I said last time that the Wilt-Chamberlain argument, or at least the version that Dworkin gives you guys, the version that you see a lot of times, is not a good argument. And look, I'm not going to say people are being unfair to Nozick, because Nozick does seem to have something like this in mind. This is part of what he has in mind with the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. Luckily, there's more going on. So what more is going on? How do we use this Wilt-Chamberlain argument to get a better argument for Nozick's position? I think we have to take a step back and look at the moral foundations, the moral assumptions of Nozick's theory. Well, Nozick has a few assumptions. Nozick will say we have a duty not to harm others. We have duties not to hurt other people, but there is no duty to help anyone else. Usually, I put this usually here, Nozick would say, yeah, sometimes there are, parents have a duty to help their children. If you agree to help somebody, if you take a job where you're supposed to help someone, then yeah, because you've agreed, because you've promised, you have a duty. The lifeguard has a duty to save people who are drowning. If you hire me to babysit, I have a duty to make sure your kids are okay. But barring some kind of special family relation or some kind of agreement, Nozick will claim we don't have duties to help others. We have duties not to harm them. We don't have any duties to help them. So look, think about it this way. I imagine, let's take two cases, right? Imagine that I steal, well, you can imagine some more simple society. Imagine I steal all the crops you have put away for winter and you are starving. I shouldn't do that. That violates a duty I have not to harm you. You are worse. You are worse off because of something I did to you. I took the crops you saved to feed you through the winter. Nozick would say, I have a duty not to do that, and the state should stop me from doing that if it exists. That's a legitimate function of the state. Stop me from harming you. Nozick would say, though, I don't have a duty to help you. If you just don't put enough crops away for the winter, I have plenty, I could share with you, but I don't feel like doing it. Well, Nozick would say I have no duty to do that. Look, not my fault that you just didn't put enough away for the winter. It would be really nice for me to help you, but I don't have a duty to. And look, it's different from the first case because in the second case I'm imagining I'm not the cause of you not having enough. If I weren't around, if I disappeared, you'd still be in the same position, having not saved enough for the winter. You'd still be starving. Or take another case, right? Imagine that Bob pushes Bill into the water. Well, let's imagine Bill can't swim. Bob has harmed Bill. Bob shouldn't do that. Bob has a duty not to push Bill into the water. And guess what? Nozick would say, having harmed Bill in this way, Bob has a duty to make good the harm he's done. If he pushes Bill into the water, Bob ought to help get him out. Bob ought to get him out. Bob is the reason Bill is in that water drowning. But take a different case. Let's imagine Bill slips on the pier, falls in the water, and is drowning, and Bob just happens to walk along. Well, Nozick would say, look, in this case, Bob hasn't harmed Bill. He's not the reason he's in the water. Bob wasn't there. Bill would be in the same boat he is now. He'd be drowning. Well, it would be very nice, Nozick would say, for Bob to save Bill, for Bob to do something, but he doesn't have to. It would be nice of him to do it, but he doesn't have to. In this case, you know, pulling Bill out of the water would be helping him. Bob played no role in putting Bill there, so Bob doesn't have a duty to do that. Now, we'll come back to this. Now, in my winner example, you guys might have been on Nozick's side. I suspect maybe, maybe you're like, well, I wouldn't be that mean, but yeah, Nozick has a point. In the Bob and Bill case, especially if Bob could save Bill without a whole lot of effort. But let's imagine Bob's a really powerful swimmer. He's, he could go right in there, save him. He just doesn't feel like doing it. Well, I think you might think, I strongly think myself, yeah, maybe Bob does in fact have a duty to go in there and help Bill. Are we really so sure that Nozick's right, there's no duty to help? Maybe not. But I think you might be able to see, if you give Nozick this, I think you might be able to see where Nozick's going, right? It would be really nice of the rich to pay for schools for everybody else. Well, but that's helping everybody else. They don't have to help if they don't want to. We'll get there, but that's the basic idea of Nozick's argument. Well, as I said last time, I think this no harm argument, this stuff about harms, is going to let Nozick develop a better argument. And Nozick's better argument is this. There's no way that Wilt having too much money harms anyone, and if it doesn't harm anyone, why should we keep Wilt from having too much money? What's more, if Wilt hasn't harmed anyone, then no one has a claim for Wilt's assistance. It would be very nice if he were to help people. That would be nice. We should pat him on the back. But no one has a right to his assistance. And if no one has a right to his assistance, it would be wrong for the state to force him to help anybody. In fact, Nozick would say, not only would it be wrong for the state to force him to help anybody, but if nobody has a right to his assistance, Nozick would make use of this Kantian language, and Nozick would say, you're using him as a mere means if you force him to help anyone. But let's dig more deeply into this no harm argument. So Nozick would say, well, look, are the people that paid $1 to see Wilt, are they harmed by having $1 less than they did before? Well, that makes no sense. They chose to pay the $1. Is Wilt harmed? Well, no, Wilt wanted the money. How is he harmed by getting the money he wanted? Well, I say, well, okay, the people who paid the money, they're not harmed. Wilt's not harmed. But all the people who, Wilt now has way more money than everybody else. That harms people. The mere fact that Wilt has too much money, that harms people. And Nozick would say, that's ridiculous. How is the mere fact that Wilt Chamberlain has a lot more money than you, how does that harm you? Well, I might say, well, it just burns me up that this Wilt Chamberlain person has so much money and I don't. And Nozick would say, well, that's envy. That's just pure envy. A, you're doing it to yourself. You don't have to think about how much money Wilt Chamberlain has all the time. B, the fact that you envy somebody doesn't give you a legitimate claim on that person. That person doesn't owe you anything because you envy their success. Well, and guess what? It would be wrong for the state to cater to your envy. So the only way that Wilt having too much money might harm you is if you are really envious, and you shouldn't be envious. That's your fault. And the state shouldn't cater to your envy. State shouldn't cater to your vices, right? And Nozick will say there's a general point here. How does the mere fact of inequality harm anyone? Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, I don't know how much money he has. It's a lot. He earns hundreds of millions. Well, how does that harm me? How does that make me any worse off than I would be if Jeff Bezos vanished from the earth tomorrow? Jeff Bezos having too much money, quote unquote, too much money doesn't harm me. What claim do I have on Jeff Bezos? You know, Albert Pujols or LeBron James, they make a lot of money. Tom Cruise. How does any of these people having all that money harm any of us? Tell me how someone having more money than you do can harm you besides you being really envious. And if it doesn't harm you, well, why should you have a claim on their money? And if the mere fact of inequality doesn't harm anyone, then why can the state come in, step in, and redistribute people's money? It would be real nice for those people who have, quote unquote, too much money to help the rest of us. But if it's not harming us, we have no right to their assistance. Or so says Nozick. Okay. So this is the better argument. This is the sort of general conclusion, the general argument, the better argument I think you can get from the Wilt Chamberlain case. As long as my actions do not harm anyone, I don't owe anyone assistance. Some people having more money than others does not harm those who have less. So those who have more money do not owe the poor assistance just because they have more money. And look, Nozick would say anything the state might force you to do, well, it falls into two. If it's not keeping you from harming somebody else or taking their property, it falls into two categories. Either the state's making you do something for your own good, and that's pretty rare, and Nozick wouldn't like that either. Nozick is as much against paternalism as Mill or Boaz. Nozick would say, no, you're the best judge of that. But more commonly, the state's doing something because it thinks it helps others. Financing public education. Financing, a road system. Something like that. Nozick would say, well, yeah, that's really nice, but you're not harming anyone. Why should the state make you help others? It'd be really nice if you were to educate other people's children or pay even for other adults to go to college. Fine, wonderful, you're a good person, but you don't owe people that. If you having more money doesn't harm these people, you're under no obligation to build roads for them or to pay for their college or to provide them a pension in their old age if they don't have enough money for their own pension. Nice of you to do that. You are under no obligation to do that. You don't owe them that unless you harm them. Well, so it would be wrong for the state to make you do that. All right, so let's finish up with Nozick's picture. Nozick says there are only two principles of justice, at least two principles of justice as far as property goes. Nozick would Nozick would definitely put another one in here as far as other stuff goes. The principle of justice, don't harm people's persons, don't do their physical bodies injury. But as far as property goes, Nozick says there's only two questions, or two principles of justice. Just acquisition and just transfer. Do you want to know, does somebody have a right to a piece of property? Ask yourself, was it justly transferred? And can you trace it back? Is there a chain where it was justly acquired? If so, whoever has that property does not owe anyone else anything. Well, okay, we might like that. We might say, okay, good, fine, Nozick. There's a complication here, though, right? What do you do when Nozick's two principles of justice haven't been followed? Well, Nozick would say, if I steal your property, I should give it back. That's not just acquisition, and any transfers that happen after that, those aren't just transfers. For Nozick, the history of a piece of property matters a whole lot. What's more, if I steal your property, not only should I give it back, I should compensate you. If I stole it and it really makes you worse off long term, well, I should compensate you not just by returning your property, but by compensating you for the damage done for when you didn't have your property. If, for a piece of property, if there's not a string of just acquisition and just transfer, well, then the current holder of that property either needs to give it back or he needs to compensate the people that the property was originally stolen from. And you guys can probably see where I'm going with this. For Nozick, your labor is just like your property. So if someone's labor was stolen, they were forced to work against their will, well then, they're owed compensation for that unpaid labor. Well, think for a second how this might complicate Nozick's picture. Nozick wants to take property very seriously. Well, what might that actually entail? Think about that for a second. We'll come back to that point. So as I said before, Nozick's principles of justice are just acquisition and just transfer. And Nozick will say, remember I said before, Nozick thinks of himself as a good Kantian. He'll say to Rawls, it's like, you Rawls, you like to talk about hypothetical consent, imagined consent, what people would consent to from your little fairy tale of the original position. But look, just acquisition and just transfer, that's real consent. And we won't talk about just acquisition, the story gets complicated, but think about just transfer, right? What more real consent could you want than I give you X amount of dollars for a book or a car or a house or whatever, and you accept. I make a choice to give you the money, you make a choice to give me what I want for the money. We have both consented. Just transfers, who in the world could possibly complain about that? If you don't like my offer, you can make a counter offer, you can tell me to go away. Same with labor, right? You know, somebody offers me X dollars an hour to work at Hardee's. Well, if I accept it, who am I to complain? I've agreed, that's real agreement. Somebody offers me X dollars a year to teach at this college. I accept it. Who am I to complain? If I don't accept it, I turn it down. Again, I have a choice. So look, Nozick would say, buying and selling, people are free to take or leave an offer. The same goes for working or not working. Someone offers you money, you can take it or turn it down. What better picture could we have of respecting people's choices? On both sides, people make a choice in any sort of free market transaction. Who's to complain? If you don't want to work there, don't take the offer. If you or on the boss's side, if you think you're paying somebody too much, well, don't offer them the money. If I buy something from you, if you accept my offer, if I buy something from you, if I accept your offer, I shouldn't complain. If I later decide the price was too high, that's on me. I consented to it. No grounds for complaint. So when we talk about just transfers, well, you might think there's no grounds to complain. Here's the problem, though. In the history, in the real world, Well, does the property people have, can it be traced back to just original acquisition? Just original acquisition would mean people taking land or other things that are unowned, or just transfer? Well, no. There is a lot of injustice in anybody's history where people's property was taken. There is a lot of injustice where people's labor was taken. A lot of the land we have in the U.S. was, by any description, taken by force or fraud from the Native Americans. It was not just transfer. What in the world do you do then? Or think of slavery, right? You know, the slaves' labor was taken from them without their consent. That labor built a lot of stuff. It's still affecting the property some people have. Well, what do we do about that? Well, here's the thing about Nozick. He really doesn't say much. He's like, well, you know, for historical injustices, compensation is owed, but that's a really complicated issue, figuring out how much it is. I'm not going to talk about, we're going to move that. We're going to move along. I'm not going to talk about that. Somebody else can do that. Philosophers are terrible for this. You know, especially famous philosophers like Nozick, who have a lot of assistants. Nozick probably thought, well, one of my grad students, somebody who's writing a PhD with me, he'll figure this topic out. I don't need to talk about it. I'll waste my time. I'll leave it for one of my grad students. I'm a nice guy. He's now got a dissertation he can write on this issue of compensation for historical injustices. Well, the grad student never wrote it. The question is left hanging. Now, Nozick would say compensation's owed. And remember, for Nozick, the history is important. It doesn't matter just acquisition, just transfer. They matter even if the original people are dead. So I think if you're a Nozickian, I think if you take property rights as seriously as Nozick thinks we should, property is super important for Nozick. I think, weirdly enough, you would almost certainly, if you were a Nozickian, have to argue for reparations for slavery. I think you would have to argue for reparations for taking the Native Americans' land. Here's the problem, though. Well, the problem for Nozick is he gives us no idea of what those reparations should be. Nozick imagines this nice little idealistic world where there's no injustices in history and everybody has the property they ought to have. Nobody has had their land or labor stolen. Well, that's not our world. And since it's not our world, how can we make Nozick's theory apply to our world? He doesn't tell us how. Yeah, reparations or compensation should be paid. Well, what in the world would they be? And there's another issue too here. By taking property rights so seriously, well, we end up with some weird results, right? Should somebody in the current world who's very poor pay for a historical injustice that his great whatever grandfather committed? Nozick, he doesn't really talk about this, but I think he's forced to say, yeah, they should. Should somebody who's very wealthy, should they be compensated because their great whatever grandfather was the victim of historical injustice? Now, to be clear, the descendants of victims of historical injustice tend to be poorer than the descendants of the people who perpetrated historical injustices. But it's not so neat, right? And when it's not so neat, if you followed Nozick's advice, you would end up taking money from some poor people and compensating some rich people because of historical injustice. Well, funnily enough, Rawls wouldn't recommend that. Rawls would say, Well, look, the history doesn't matter so much for Rawls. What matters is, are you poor now? What's the distribution look like now? That's the question for Rawls. Nozick, where the history matters, how you got your property matters so very much, well, this is just going to be a neat result of it. You're going to be hard-pressed not to accept it, like it or not. If you don't like it, well, that might be a reason not to take property rights as seriously as Nozick does. If you do take property rights as seriously as Nozick does, well, I think you're going to have a heck of a time not admitting that reparations are owed. The complicated question, though, beyond all that, the reason I say can we apply Nozick's philosophy to the real world, good luck figuring out exactly how much. So I don't want to pile on Nozick, but I think I would be sort of careless in my duties as a philosophy teacher if I didn't point out one more problem with Nozick's position. And this is a problem that libertarian positions like Nozick's are going to have, generally. Libertarians, Nozick isn't alone in this, libertarians will generally say, we have no duties to help others. We have duties not to harm others. We don't have duties to help them. Is that true? Well, imagine Peter Singer has his own story to test whether this is true. Imagine I see a child drowning in shallow water. And I could save him. You know, it's shallow water, it's deep enough to drown him, but, you know, it's only like 3 or 4 feet. It's not even that rough. It's not going to knock me off my feet. I just need to wade in, grab him, and wade out. Well, maybe 3 is a bit much. It's only 2 feet, right? But that water is real cold. And it's real muddy. Imagine it's swamp water, right? Well, it's real cold and real muddy, and I'm wearing my nicest pants. Imagine I told you this, and I'm like, yeah, he's in that water. That was cold water, and I was wearing nice pants. Yeah, it just stinks for Junior, doesn't it? Well, stinks for him, stinks for his family, but hey, I'm under no duty to save anybody. It would be nice of me to do it, but I'm not under any obligation, so I just let that kid drown. If I told you this story, you would probably call me all kinds of names. You would think I am a monster, right? And if I said, well, look, you're just confused. Look, I didn't harm the kid. You know, if I hadn't been there, presumably, you know, when I came there, he had already fallen in the water. Not my fault he's in the water. If I hadn't been there, he'd have drowned the same as he did. I didn't hurt him. He's not worse off because I was there. You know, I watched him drown, you know. I'm the only one worse off. Maybe I'm psychologically traumatized, but if I hadn't been there, no one else was there, he'd have drowned anyway. Who cares? How did I harm him? I didn't harm him. I didn't make him worse off. So, well, I didn't do anything wrong. What I think you would say is, no, even if you didn't harm this kid, I'm not confused. You have a duty to save others when you can do so at minimal cost to yourself. And I say, but my pants, these aren't Gap pants. These aren't, I got these, you know, I got these at Banana Republic. These aren't Old Navy. These are nice. I just got them. My pants. And you say, oh my God, you sociopath. Yes, it would cost you your pants. Let's assume you're never getting that stuff out. But the issue is a child's life, you monster. If you can save a child from drowning at the cost of your pants, even your nice pants, you should save that child from drowning. Well, if you admit that, that's a huge problem for Nozick. Well, why? Well, if you admit that, then you admit we have duties to help others. that we blame people for not helping others. And if we have duties to help others, when we can help others at minimal cost to ourselves, then what's so wrong if the state forces us to keep our duties, forces us to help others? If I can save an old lady or an old man from starving to death by giving a bit of my money that I won't miss anyway to finance his pension, well, why shouldn't the state force me to do that? I say, but I can't buy that nice camera now because you're taking my money in payroll tax. Again, you'd say, you're a monster. Keeping this person from starving is more important than your camera. If we have duties to help others, especially others in great need, then why can't the state enforce those duties? And if the state can't enforce those duties, then maybe the state has every right to force us to pay into things like Social Security. Yes, me having money does not make Granny worse off. But if we could keep Granny from starving by taking some money that I won't really miss that much, well, is the state wrong to do that even if I'm not harming her? And if that's the case, then Nozick's libertarian argument doesn't really work. Well, look, I've been pretty hard on Nozick in these slides. I do think, there's a lingering thing here from Nozick. You guys can hear my dog Moxie. I showed you a picture of her, sorry. I do think that there's an interesting issue from Nozick, so we'll start there next time. And hopefully my dog will have shut up by then.